deep beneath the mountains of central Germany, in a place the Nazis called Mittelbau-Dora, thousands of prisoners were building the future of warfare. These weren't soldiers. They weren't engineers who volunteered for the Reich. They were starving men, worked to the bone, forced to assemble the most advanced weapon the world had ever seen. The V-2 rocket, a missile so fast it broke the sound barrier. So deadly it could level entire city blocks in London, before anyone even heard it coming. But here's what the history books won't tell you. These prisoners, these forgotten men with numbers tattooed on their arms and death sentences hanging over their heads, found a way to fight back. And their weapon, it wasn't a gun, it wasn't a bomb. It was urine. Yes, you heard that right. They urinated into the guidance systems of Nazi superweapons, and in doing so, they may have saved thousands of lives. This is the story the Third Reich tried to bury. This is the story of the most disgusting act of heroism in World War II. It's 1943 and Adolf Hitler is losing. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The Allies are closing in from the West. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, is being shot out of the sky faster than they can replace pilots. Hitler needs a miracle. He needs a weapon so terrifying, so unstoppable, that it will force the Allies to their knees and beg for peace. Enter Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and morally bankrupt rocket scientist who would later help America reach the moon. But in 1943, von Braun wasn't working for NASA. He was working for the SS, and his masterpiece was the Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2, better known as the V-2 rocket. This wasn't just a bomb with a fancy engine. This was a 13-ton missile that could travel at over 3,500 miles per hour, reaching the edge of space, before plummeting down onto its target with the force of a small earthquake. It was silent. It was invisible. It was death from above, and there was no defense against it. But building the V-2 required precision. It required slave labor. And it required a place where the screams of dying men wouldn't disturb the engineers. So the Nazis carved out an enormous underground factory inside a mountain near Nordhausen, Germany. They called it Mittelbau-Dora, and it was hell on earth. 60,000 prisoners were sent there. 20,000 of them would never leave. They worked 20-hour shifts in freezing tunnels with no ventilation, breathing in toxic fumes from rocket fuel. They slept in wooden bunks stacked 4 high, covered in lice, eating watery soup that barely kept them alive. The guards beat them for sport. The SS shot them for slowing down. And all the while, they were building the weapon that would rain terror on London, Antwerp, and Paris. But here's the thing about desperate men. When you take everything from them, when you strip them down to nothing but bones and willpower, they find ways to resist. And the prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora discovered something the Nazis never anticipated. The V-2 rocket, for all its technological brilliance, had a fatal flaw. Its guidance system was delicate. It relied on gyroscopes, intricate wiring, and sensitive electronic components that had to be calibrated perfectly. And the prisoners. They were the ones installing those components. They were the ones soldering the wires. They were the ones with access to the very brain of the missile. And so in the shadows of that freezing factory, they began to sabotage. It started small. A wire connected to the wrong terminal. A bolt loosened just enough to cause a vibration. A gyroscope misaligned by a fraction of a degree. The SS inspectors couldn't catch everything. They didn't have time. Hitler wanted his vengeance weapons launched as fast as possible. So the prisoners got bolder. They urinated into fuel lines. They spat into circuit boards. They rubbed their filthy hands, covered in grease and grime, over the sensitive electronics. And yes, when the opportunity arose, they urinated directly into the guidance systems. It was disgusting, it was degrading, but it worked. The moisture corroded the wiring. The salt in their urine created electrical shorts. The acids ate away at delicate components. And when those rockets finally launched, many of them veered off course, exploded mid-flight, or crashed harmlessly into empty fields. The Nazis never figured it out. They blamed manufacturing defects. They blamed rushed production schedules. They blamed everyone except the prisoners standing right in front of them, silently waging a war with the only weapons they had left, their bodies and their defiance. By the time the Allies liberated Mittelbau-Dora in April of 1945, over 3,000 V-2 rockets had been built. But historians estimate that nearly 30% of them failed to reach their targets. How many of those failures were due to sabotage? We'll never know for certain. But the prisoners who survived, the ones who lived long enough to tell their story, swore that every drop counted. To understand how these prisoners ended up in that nightmare, you have to go back to the beginning of the Nazi rocket program. In 1937, when most of the world was still recovering from the Great Depression, a small team of German scientists was already dreaming of space. They set up shop at a remote testing facility on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. It was supposed to be about exploration, about pushing the boundaries of human achievement. But Adolf Hitler didn't care about reaching the stars. He cared about raining fire on his enemies. So the rocket scientists, led by Werner von Braun, made a deal with the devil. They would get unlimited funding, state-of-the-art laboratories, and all the resources they needed. In exchange, they would build weapons. And for years it worked. They developed prototypes, tested engines, and slowly perfected the technology that would eventually become the V-2. But by 1943, the war was turning against Germany, and suddenly, Hitler wasn't interested in prototypes anymore. He wanted production. He wanted thousands of rockets. And he wanted them now. The problem was scale. Building one rocket in a laboratory was one thing. Building thousands of them in the middle of a war, while your factories were being bombed to rubble by Allied air raids, was something else entirely. The Nazis needed a workforce that was expendable, silent, and absolutely disposable. They needed slaves. So Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, made a proposal. Why waste resources guarding prisoners in camps when you could work them to death building superweapons? It was efficient, it was brutal, and it was exactly what Hitler wanted. In August of 1943, the first transports of prisoners arrived at Mittelbau-Dora. They came from Buchenwald, from Auschwitz, from every corner of the Nazi Empire. They were Jews, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, resistance fighters, and anyone else the Reich deemed unworthy of life. They were told they were being sent to a work camp. What they found was a death factory. The conditions inside Mittelbau-Dora were so horrific that even other concentration camp survivors who were transferred there later said it was the worst place they had ever seen. The tunnels were damp and freezing. The air was thick with dust from blasting operations and toxic fumes from rocket fuel. There was no sunlight, no fresh air, no escape. The prisoners worked in shifts that stretched for 20 hours or more, hauling massive steel components, assembling rocket parts with their bare hands, and drilling deeper into the mountain to expand the factory. If you collapsed from exhaustion, the guards beat you until you got up or until you stopped moving permanently. If you were too sick to work, you were shot or sent to the gas chambers at Bergen-Belsen. There were no doctors, no medicine, no mercy. The only way to survive was to keep moving, keep working, and keep your head down. But survival alone wasn't enough for some of these men. They had seen their families murdered. They had watched their friends die in the tunnels. They had nothing left to lose. And so, quietly, carefully, they began to resist. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't organized. There was no underground network passing secret messages or planning coordinated strikes. It was simply individuals, scattered across the factory floor, making tiny decisions that added up to something greater. A French engineer would swap out a functional component for a damaged one. A Polish machinist would file down a bolt just enough to weaken it. A Russian prisoner would pour water into a fuel tank. And when the opportunity arose, when no guards were watching, they would do the unthinkable. They would urinate into the guidance systems, knowing full well that if they were caught, they would be tortured and killed on the spot. The brilliance of their sabotage was that it was nearly invisible. The rockets still looked perfect, they still passed inspections. They still rolled out of the factory and onto the launch rails. But somewhere inside, in the delicate electronics that controlled their trajectory, there was a time bomb waiting to go off. A corroded wire. A shorted circuit. A component that would fail at 30,000 feet and send the missile spiraling into the ocean instead of into a crowded neighborhood in London. The prisoners couldn't stop the war. They couldn't free themselves. But they could make damn sure that every rocket they built had a chance of failing. And in a war where every single missile could kill dozens of innocent people, that chance mattered. The V-2 rocket wasn't just another weapon. It was a technological marvel that shouldn't have existed in 1943. While most militaries were still perfecting propeller-driven aircraft, Nazi Germany was launching missiles into the edge of space. The rocket stood 46 feet tall, weighed over 13 tons when fully fueled, and carried a 1-ton warhead filled with high explosives. Its engine burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol, producing 70,000 pounds of thrust. It could reach an altitude of 55 miles, higher than any aircraft of the era could fly, and then plummet back down at speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour. There was no warning, no air raid siren, no time to run for shelter. One moment, a street in London was filled with people going about their day. The next moment, an entire block was obliterated. And because the rocket traveled faster than sound, the explosion came before the sound of its approach. Survivors described hearing the blast first, then the terrifying scream of the rocket tearing through the atmosphere. It was psychological warfare as much as it was physical destruction. But what made the V-2 truly dangerous wasn't just its speed or its payload. It was the guidance system. This was cutting-edge technology, decades ahead of anything the Allies had. The rocket used a combination of gyroscopes, accelerometers, and analog computers to calculate its trajectory in real time. During the first 25 seconds of flight, the guidance system would adjust the rocket's fins to keep it on course. Then, at a predetermined moment, the engine would cut off and the rocket would continue on a ballistic arc toward its target. In theory, this system could hit a target within a few hundred yards from over 200 miles away. In practice, it was far less accurate. Even under perfect conditions, the V-2 had a margin of error of several miles, and when prisoners started sabotaging the guidance systems, that margin of error became catastrophic. Rockets that were supposed to hit military installations in Antwerp ended up crashing into farmland. Missiles aimed at London detonated over the English Channel. Some never even made it off the launch pad, exploding in massive fireballs that killed German technicians and soldiers. The sabotage wasn't just about the guidance systems, though. The prisoners found vulnerabilities everywhere. The fuel lines were easy targets. A small puncture, invisible to the naked eye, would cause a slow leak that wouldn't be noticed until the rocket was already in flight. By then, the fuel pressure would drop, the engine would lose thrust, and the rocket would fall short of its target or explode mid-air. The wiring was another weak point. The V-2 had miles of electrical cables running through its frame, connecting sensors, valves, and ignition systems. A single wire connected to the wrong terminal could cause a chain reaction of failures. The prisoners became experts at making mistakes that looked like accidents. A wire soldered with just a little too much heat would create a weak joint that would break under the vibration of launch. A connector installed backwards would pass inspection, but fail the moment the rocket experienced the stress of flight. And then there was the urine. It sounds absurd. It sounds like something out of a dark comedy rather than a historical account. But for the prisoners, it was one of the most effective tools they had. Urine contains salts, acids, and organic compounds that are highly corrosive to electronics. When introduced into a sealed guidance system, it would create moisture buildup, short circuits, and chemical reactions that would degrade the components over time. The beauty of it was that the damage wasn't immediate. The rocket would pass inspection. It would be loaded onto a transport truck and shipped to a launch site in occupied France or the Netherlands. And only when it was fired, when it was too late to fix anything, would the sabotage reveal itself. The guidance system would fail. The rocket would veer off course. And somewhere, in a tunnel deep beneath a German mountain, a prisoner would know that his act of defiance had worked. But the risks were enormous. The SS guards at Mittelbau-Dora were paranoid and brutal. They knew that sabotage was possible, and they conducted random inspections, looking for any sign of tampering. If a prisoner was caught, the punishment was immediate and public. They would be dragged out in front of the other workers and hanged from the factory rafters as a warning. Sometimes the guards didn't even need proof. If a rocket failed during a test, they would randomly select prisoners from the assembly line and execute them on the spot. It was collective punishment designed to create fear and paranoia. But even that wasn't enough to stop the sabotage, because for many of these men, death was already a certainty. The only question was whether they would die as victims or as resistance fighters. The prisoners who arrived at Mittelbau-Dora came from every corner of Nazi-occupied Europe, and they brought with them skills that the SS desperately needed but could never fully control. There were French engineers who had worked in automotive factories before the war, Polish machinists who knew precision metalwork, Czech electricians who understood complex wiring systems, Soviet prisoners of war who had been trained as technicians in the Red Army. Even German political prisoners, communists and social democrats who had been locked up for opposing Hitler, found themselves forced to build the very weapons that would terrorize their former allies. The Nazis assumed that fear and starvation would be enough to ensure obedience. They assumed that men on the brink of death would be too broken to resist. But they were wrong, because these weren't just random laborers. They were skilled workers who understood exactly how the rockets functioned, and more importantly, they understood how to make them fail in ways that would never be traced back to sabotage. The key to successful sabotage was subtlety. If a prisoner smashed a component with a hammer or cut a wire in half, it would be obvious. The guards would investigate. People would die. So instead, the sabotage had to look like accidents, manufacturing defects, or the inevitable result of rushed production under impossible conditions. A bolt that was supposed to be tightened to a specific torque would be left just loose enough to vibrate free during flight. A rubber seal that was supposed to keep fuel from leaking would be installed with a tiny nick in it, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. A gyroscope that needed to be perfectly balanced would be calibrated just slightly off-center. These were the kinds of mistakes that could happen naturally in any factory, especially one operating under wartime conditions with exhausted workers and inadequate quality control. But when they happened consistently, when they happened on purpose, they added up to a silent war being waged from within. The urine sabotage was reserved for moments when the opportunity was perfect and the risk could be minimized. It wasn't something that could be done casually or in front of others. The guidance systems were housed in sealed compartments near the nose of the rocket, and access was limited to specific points during assembly. A prisoner would have to wait until the guards were distracted, until the SS inspectors had moved to another section of the factory, until the other workers were focused on their own tasks. Then, in a matter of seconds, they would urinate into an access panel, a ventilation shaft, or directly onto circuit boards that were temporarily exposed during installation. The liquid would seep into the electronics, pooling in places where it wouldn't be noticed until it was far too late. By the time the rocket was sealed up, shipped out, and prepared for launch, the damage would already be done. And the prisoner who did it would go back to work, knowing that he might have just saved lives on the other side of Europe. But sabotage wasn't just a technical challenge, it was a psychological one. Every prisoner at Mittelbau-Dora was living on borrowed time. The average life expectancy in the camp was measured in months, sometimes weeks. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion killed more people than the executions ever did. The men who chose to sabotage the rockets weren't just risking their own lives, they were risking the lives of everyone around them. If the SS suspected widespread sabotage, they would conduct mass executions. They would round up entire work crews and hang them in the tunnels. They would shut down production, investigate every component, and make an example out of anyone they even remotely suspected. So the saboteurs had to be careful. They had to be patient. They couldn't tell anyone what they were doing, not even their closest friends, because trust was a luxury no one could afford. The only way to survive was to act alone, to make your small acts of resistance in silence, and to hope that somewhere, somehow, it would make a difference. And it did. By late 1944, the Germans were launching dozens of V-2 rockets every week, and the failure rate was staggering. Official Nazi records recovered after the war show that nearly 1 in 3 rockets either exploded on the launch pad, veered wildly off course, or failed to detonate on impact. The Germans blamed rushed production. They blamed inferior materials. They blamed the Allied bombing raids that had disrupted supply lines, but they never blamed the prisoners. They never considered that the men they had beaten, starved, and worked to death might have been fighting back the entire time. And by the time they figured it out, it was too late. The war was ending. The Allies were closing in, and the prisoners, the ones who survived, had already won. By September of 1944, the V-2 campaign was in full swing and London was burning. The first operational rocket slammed into Chiswick, a quiet suburb in West London, on the 8th of September. It came without warning. No air raid sirens, no time to take cover. The explosion killed 3 people instantly and left a crater 20 feet wide. Within minutes, rumors spread across the city. Some thought it was a gas main explosion. Others whispered about a new German superweapon. The British government said nothing. They imposed a media blackout, terrified that if the public knew the truth, mass panic would follow. But the rockets kept coming. 2, 3, 5 a day, then 10. By the end of the campaign, over 3,000 V-2 rockets would be launched, killing nearly 3,000 civilians in London alone and thousands more in Antwerp and other cities. But here's what the British government couldn't understand. Why were so many of these rockets missing their targets? Why were they exploding in empty fields, crashing into the ocean, or detonating prematurely? British intelligence officers studied the wreckage. They analyzed the trajectory patterns, and they came to a conclusion that baffled them. The rockets were too inaccurate to be purely technological failures. Something else was going on. At first, they suspected Allied bombing raids had damaged the manufacturing facilities, causing quality control issues, and that was partly true. The Allies had been relentlessly bombing Peenemünde and other German rocket sites since 1943. But the factories at Mittelbau-Dora were underground, hidden inside mountains, immune to airstrikes. So what was causing the failures? British engineers recovered fragments of crashed rockets and examined them closely. They found corroded wiring. They found fuel lines that had been punctured. They found guidance systems that showed signs of moisture damage and electrical shorts. None of it made sense from a manufacturing defect standpoint. These weren't the kinds of failures you would expect from rushed production or poor materials. These were failures that looked almost deliberate. But how could that be possible? The rockets were being built in a heavily guarded concentration camp by prisoners who were barely alive. The idea that those prisoners could be systematically sabotaging the most advanced weapons in the Nazi arsenal seemed impossible. And yet, that's exactly what was happening. The prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora had developed an entire underground culture of resistance. It wasn't organized in the traditional sense. There were no secret meetings, no written plans, no central leadership. But there was an unspoken understanding. If you had the opportunity to sabotage a rocket without getting caught, you did it. And you didn't talk about it. You didn't brag. You didn't even tell your bunkmates. Because the moment you opened your mouth, you put everyone at risk. So the sabotage spread through the factory like a virus, invisible and unstoppable. A French prisoner working on the fuel system would leave a valve slightly open. A Polish electrician would cross 2 wires in a junction box. A Russian laborer hauling components would drop a gyroscope just hard enough to throw off its calibration without leaving visible damage. And when the guards weren't looking, when the moment was right, prisoners would urinate into access panels, ventilation shafts, and any opening they could find that led to the rocket's internal systems. The psychological toll of this resistance was immense. Every act of sabotage was a gamble with death. If you were caught, you would be tortured for information about other saboteurs, then hanged in front of the entire camp. If a rocket failed during a test launch, the SS would randomly execute workers from the assembly line, even if they had nothing to do with the failure. The guards used fear as a weapon, hoping to break the prisoner's will to resist. But for many of these men, the fear of dying without fighting back was worse than the fear of execution. They had already lost everything. Their families were dead. Their homes were destroyed. Their bodies were wasting away from starvation and disease. The only thing they had left was the choice of how they would die. And they chose to die as saboteurs, as resistance fighters, as men who refused to build the instruments of their own destruction without fighting back. The impact of their resistance is impossible to quantify with absolute precision, but the numbers tell a story. Of the roughly 3,000 V-2 rockets launched during the war, historians estimate that at least 800 to 1,000 failed to reach their intended targets. Some exploded on launch. Some veered off course and crashed into the sea. Some landed miles away from their targets in empty countryside. The Nazis blamed manufacturing problems, weather conditions, and operational errors. But after the war, when Allied investigators interviewed survivors from Mittelbau-Dora, the truth began to emerge. Prisoner after prisoner described the sabotage. They described the loosened bolts, the crossed wires, the deliberate mistakes. And yes, they described urinating into the guidance systems. At first, Allied officials were skeptical. It sounded too bizarre, too crude to be effective. But when engineers examined the evidence, when they looked at the patterns of failures and the condition of recovered components, they realized the prisoners had been telling the truth all along. The winter of 1944 was the deadliest period at Mittelbau-Dora. As the war turned decisively against Germany, the Nazis became more desperate, more brutal, and more demanding. Production quotas were increased. Work shifts were extended. The already meager food rations were cut even further. Prisoners who had once received a thin soup and a piece of bread now got nothing but watery broth with a few potato peels floating in it. The cold inside the tunnels was unbearable. Men worked in temperatures barely above freezing, wearing nothing but thin striped uniforms and wooden clogs that fell apart within weeks. Frostbite was common. Pneumonia swept through the barracks like wildfire. And still the rockets had to be built. The SS guards didn't care if you were sick. They didn't care if you were dying. If you couldn't work, you were disposable. Every morning the dead were hauled out of the barracks and stacked like cordwood near the entrance to the tunnels. Every evening new prisoners arrived to replace them. It was a conveyor belt of death, and the only way to survive was to become invisible, to work just hard enough to avoid a beating, and to find small moments of resistance wherever you could. For the prisoners who were sabotaging the rockets, the increased pressure made their work more dangerous but also more necessary. The Nazis were launching V-2s at an unprecedented rate, trying to break Allied morale before the inevitable invasion of Germany. Every rocket that made it out of Mittelbau-Dora was a potential massacre. Every rocket that failed was a small victory. So the saboteurs adapted. They became more creative, more careful, and more ruthless in their methods. Some prisoners began deliberately damaging tools and equipment, making it look like accidents caused by exhaustion or carelessness. A wrench would slip and crack a fuel line fitting. A drill bit would break inside a bolt hole, rendering the component unusable. A welding torch would overheat and warp a structural support. These were the kinds of mistakes that happened in any factory under extreme conditions, and the SS couldn't punish every accident without halting production entirely. So the prisoners exploited that vulnerability, turning the Nazis' own desperation against them. The urine sabotage evolved as well. Prisoners discovered that timing was everything. If you urinated into a guidance system too early in the assembly process, it might be detected during quality checks. But if you waited until the very end, until the rocket was nearly complete and the access panels were about to be sealed permanently, the chances of detection dropped to almost zero. Some prisoners even began coordinating without speaking. A machinist would leave an access panel loosely fastened, knowing that an electrician working the next shift would understand the signal and take advantage of the opening. It was a silent language of resistance, communicated through subtle gestures and shared understanding. And because the prisoners came from so many different countries and spoke so many different languages, this wordless communication became essential. A Polish worker and a French engineer might not share a common language, but they both understood what it meant when a panel was left unsecured or when a component was positioned in a way that made sabotage easier. But the most effective sabotage wasn't always the most dramatic. Sometimes it was simply a matter of doing your job poorly, in ways that were impossible to detect. The V-2 rocket required thousands of individual components to work in perfect harmony. If even one part was slightly defective, the entire system could fail. So prisoners would file metal parts to tolerances that were just barely within acceptable limits. Knowing that under the stress of launch those parts would fail, they would install gaskets and seals that looked perfect, but had microscopic flaws that would cause leaks at high pressure. They would calibrate instruments to specifications that were technically correct, but practically useless. It was sabotage disguised as incompetence, and the Nazis couldn't tell the difference. They assumed the failures were the result of exhausted, starving workers making honest mistakes, and in a way they were right. But they were also wrong, because every mistake was deliberate, Every failure was intentional, and every rocket that crashed was a small act of revenge. The prisoners paid a terrible price for their resistance. In January of 1945, the SS executed over 100 workers in a single day after a series of rocket failures during test launches. The guards selected men at random from the assembly line, dragged them outside and shot them in front of the others. It was meant to be a deterrent, a message that sabotage would not be tolerated, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of breaking the prisoners' will, it hardened their resolve, because now they knew for certain that their sabotage was working. The Nazis wouldn't have executed so many people if the rockets were functioning properly. The failures were becoming too frequent, too costly, and too obvious to ignore. And that meant the prisoners were winning, even if the cost of victory was measured in their own blood. By March of 1945, the end was near. The Soviet Red Army was pushing toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine in the west. The Third Reich was collapsing, and everyone at Mittelbau-Dora knew it. The guards became more erratic, more violent, more desperate. Some of them began destroying documents, trying to erase evidence of their crimes. Others doubled down on the brutality, as if killing more prisoners would somehow change the outcome of the war. The rocket production continued, but it was chaos now. Supply lines were cut. Materials were running out. The carefully engineered assembly process that had once produced dozens of rockets per week was breaking down. And in that chaos, the prisoners found even more opportunities for sabotage. Components that were supposed to go into one rocket would be swapped with defective parts from another. Guidance systems would be installed in the wrong orientation. Fuel tanks would be filled with contaminated propellant. The Nazis were so focused on meeting their quotas, so obsessed with launching as many rockets as possible before the Allies arrived, that quality control became almost non-existent. This was the moment the saboteurs had been waiting for. For months they had worked in fear, taking tiny risks, making subtle changes that might or might not make a difference. But now, with the guards distracted and the factory in disarray, they could be bolder. Prisoners began openly swapping components in front of each other, trusting that their fellow inmates wouldn't report them. Some even began sabotaging multiple rockets in a single shift, knowing that if they were caught they would die, but also knowing that they were probably going to die anyway. The SS was already evacuating the camp, preparing to march the prisoners deeper into Germany to prevent them from being liberated by the advancing Allies. Everyone understood what that meant. The Nazis weren't going to leave witnesses. The prisoners who couldn't walk would be shot. The ones who could walk would be marched until they dropped dead from exhaustion, so if you were going to die, you might as well die fighting. The final act of mass sabotage happened in the last 2 weeks of March. With the Americans less than 50 miles away, the SS ordered one final production push. They wanted to launch every remaining rocket, to inflict as much damage as possible before Germany fell. The prisoners worked around the clock, assembling rockets at a frantic pace. But by now, nearly every prisoner in the factory was involved in sabotage in some form. Bolts were left loose, wires were crossed, fuel lines were punctured. And in the guidance compartments of dozens of rockets, prisoners urinated one last time, knowing it might be the last act of resistance they would ever commit. When those rockets were finally loaded onto trucks and transported to launch sites across Germany, they carried with them the accumulated sabotage of 2 years of silent warfare. And when they were fired, the results were catastrophic. Rockets exploded on the launch pad, killing German soldiers and technicians. Others veered wildly off course, crashing into forests and farmland. Some never even ignited, their fuel systems clogged with debris and contaminated by bodily fluids. The Nazis never understood what had happened. In their final reports captured by Allied forces after the war, German engineers blamed the failures on everything except sabotage. They blamed the quality of materials. They blamed the inexperience of the launch crews. They blamed Allied bombing raids that had disrupted logistics. But they never blamed the prisoners. Even at the very end, even as their empire crumbled around them, the Nazis couldn't conceive that the people they had brutalized and starved and worked to death had been systematically destroying their superweapons from the inside. It was a blind spot, born of arrogance and racism. The Nazis believed that their prisoners were subhuman, too broken and too stupid to mount any kind of organized resistance, and that belief cost them dearly. On April 11, 1945, American soldiers from the 3rd Armored Division arrived at Mittelbau-Dora. What they found was beyond comprehension. Thousands of corpses lay scattered throughout the tunnels and barracks. Survivors, barely alive, stumbled toward the liberators like walking skeletons. The stench of death was overwhelming. The tunnels were filled with unfinished rockets, tools, and the remnants of the Nazi war machine. But among the survivors were the saboteurs, the men who had risked everything to fight back in the only way they could. And when Allied intelligence officers began interviewing them, when they started piecing together the story of the sabotage, they realized they were standing in the presence of heroes. Not the kind of heroes who charged into battle with guns blazing, but the kind who fought a silent war in the shadows, who weaponized their own bodily fluids, and who saved lives they would never meet. The liberation of Mittelbau-Dora was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of horror. American soldiers, hardened by years of combat, broke down in tears when they saw the conditions inside the camp. One soldier later wrote in his diary that he had seen men killed in battle, had seen entire towns destroyed by artillery, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of living human beings reduced to animated corpses. The prisoners were so emaciated that their bones protruded through their skin. Their eyes were sunken into their skulls. Many couldn't stand without help. Some had gone insane from the trauma and malnutrition, wandering the tunnels in a daze, unable to comprehend that they were finally free. The American medics set up field hospitals immediately, but for many prisoners, liberation came too late. Hundreds died in the days and weeks following their rescue, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. The survivors were given food, medical care, and the promise that they would be sent home. But home for most of them no longer existed. Their families were dead. Their towns were destroyed. They had nothing to return to except the memory of what they had endured. As the Allied investigators began documenting the atrocities at Mittelbau-Dora, they also started to uncover the full scope of the sabotage. At first, the stories seemed too incredible to believe. Prisoners urinating into rocket guidance systems. It sounded like propaganda, like something invented to boost morale. But as more survivors came forward with the same accounts, as engineers examined the wreckage of failed V-2 rockets and found evidence of deliberate tampering, the truth became undeniable. The prisoners had been waging a secret war, and they had been remarkably effective. Allied intelligence officers compiled reports estimating that at least 30% of all V-2 rockets failed, due to sabotage or defects that could be traced back to deliberate acts by the prisoners. That meant that out of the 3,000 rockets launched, nearly 1,000 had been compromised in some way. And while it was impossible to know exactly how many lives were saved by those failures, the estimates ranged from several hundred to several thousand civilians who would have died if the rockets had functioned as intended. But the story of the sabotage was quickly buried. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the world was focused on other narratives: the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the Nuremberg trials, the liberation of the concentration camps, the heroism of soldiers on the front lines. There was no room in the public consciousness for a story about prisoners urinating into rocket guidance systems. It was too crude, too uncomfortable, too difficult to fit into the grand narratives of heroism and sacrifice, and so the saboteurs were forgotten. A few survivors wrote memoirs that mentioned the resistance, but they were published in French, Polish, and Russian, languages that most Americans and British readers couldn't access. The official histories of the V-2 program focused on the technological achievements and the scientists like Wernher von Braun, who was brought to America after the war to work on the space program. The prisoners who had risked their lives to stop those rockets were reduced to footnotes if they were mentioned at all. Even more troubling was what happened to Wernher von Braun and the other Nazi scientists who had overseen the V-2 program. Instead of being prosecuted for war crimes, they were recruited by the United States in a program called Operation Paperclip. The American government wanted their expertise in rocketry to compete with the Soviet Union in the emerging Cold War. So von Braun, the man who had walked through the tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora and witnessed the suffering of the prisoners, the man who had known exactly where his rockets were being built and under what conditions was given a new life in America. He became a celebrity, a hero of the space race, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that would eventually take humans to the moon. He appeared on television. He consulted for Disney. He was celebrated as a visionary. And the prisoners who had sabotaged his weapons, they were forgotten. Their names were lost. Their stories were buried in archives that few people bothered to search. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s when historians began conducting oral history projects with Holocaust survivors that the story of the sabotage began to re-emerge. Survivors who had kept silent for decades, ashamed of what they had been forced to do, finally felt safe enough to speak. They described the sabotage in detail. They named other prisoners who had participated. They provided dates, locations, and specific examples of how the resistance had operated. And slowly, painstakingly, historians began to reconstruct the truth. They cross-referenced survivor testimonies with German engineering reports. They examined recovered rocket components. They analyzed failure rates and launch data. And the evidence was overwhelming. The prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora had not been passive victims. They had been active resistance fighters, waging a war with the only weapons they had, their knowledge, their courage, and their bodily fluids. The question that haunts historians to this day is simple but profound. How many lives were saved by the sabotage at Mittelbau-Dora? The answer is impossible to calculate with precision, but we can make educated estimates based on the data we have. The V-2 rocket carried a 1-ton warhead. When it struck a densely populated area, it could kill dozens of people instantly and injure hundreds more. In London alone, over 2,700 people were killed by V-2 strikes, and another 6,000 were seriously injured. In Antwerp, Belgium, which was hit even harder because it served as a major Allied supply port, over 1,500 civilians died from rocket attacks. Now consider this. If 30% of the rockets failed due to sabotage, that means roughly 900 rockets never reached their intended targets. If each of those rockets would have killed an average of just 5 people, that's 4,500 lives saved. If the average was 10 people per rocket, that's 9,000 lives. And those are conservative estimates that don't account for the rockets that exploded on launch pads, killing German soldiers and technicians, or the rockets that crashed into military installations instead of civilian neighborhoods because their guidance systems failed. But the impact of the sabotage went beyond just the number of lives saved. It was psychological warfare. Every failed rocket was a blow to German morale and a boost to Allied confidence. The Nazis had invested enormous resources into the V-2 program. They had diverted critical materials, labor, and scientific expertise away from other military projects. They had built massive underground factories. They had sacrificed thousands of prisoners to keep production running. And for what? For a weapon that failed 1 out of every 3 times it was fired. German engineers were baffled, launch crews were demoralized, and the German High Command began to question whether the V-2 program was worth the cost. By early 1945, some Nazi officials were quietly suggesting that the resources being poured into rocket production would be better spent on conventional weapons like tanks and artillery. The prisoners had done more than just sabotage individual rockets. They had undermined confidence in the entire program. The sabotage also had a direct impact on the development of post-war rocket technology. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union seized German V-2 rockets' blueprints and scientists. They studied everything about the program, trying to understand why it had been so innovative, but also so unreliable. American engineers examining captured rockets found evidence of the sabotage, the corroded wiring, the damaged components, the signs of moisture intrusion into sealed systems. And they learned from it. They developed new quality control procedures. They designed redundant systems to prevent single-point failures. They created testing protocols that would catch the kinds of subtle defects the prisoners had introduced. In a strange way, the saboteurs at Mittelbau-Dora helped shape the future of space exploration by forcing engineers to build more robust, more reliable systems. The rockets that eventually took humans to the moon were better designed because of the lessons learned from the failures caused by desperate men urinating into guidance systems. But perhaps the most important legacy of the sabotage is what it tells us about resistance under impossible conditions. The prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora had every reason to give up. They were starving. They were dying. They were surrounded by guards who would kill them without hesitation. They had no weapons, no organization, no hope of rescue. And yet, they found a way to fight back. They turned their own bodies into weapons. They used their knowledge and skills to undermine the Nazi war machine from within. They risked torture and execution for the chance to save people they would never meet, in cities they would never see. It was resistance in its purest form, resistance not for personal gain or glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. Because if you have the power to save a life, even at the cost of your own, you have a moral obligation to try. The survivors of Mittelbau-Dora rarely spoke about their acts of sabotage. Some felt shame, believing that they should have done more, that they should have resisted harder, that they should have saved more lives. Others felt guilt for surviving when so many of their friends had died. And some simply wanted to forget, to bury the memories of what they had endured and move on with their lives. But in the final years of their lives, as historians began to recognize the importance of their story, some of the saboteurs agreed to tell what they had done. They spoke about the fear, the desperation, and the tiny moments of triumph when they knew they had damaged a rocket. And they all said the same thing. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like men who had done what anyone would have done in their position. But that's exactly what makes them heroes, because they did what most people can't even imagine doing. They fought back when fighting back seemed impossible. Today, if you visit the site of Mittelbau-Dora, you'll find a memorial. There are plaques in multiple languages describing the horrors that took place in those tunnels. There are preserved sections of the underground factory, where you can still see the rail lines that once carried rocket components deep into the mountain. There are photographs of skeletal prisoners and testimonies from survivors. But nowhere in that memorial will you find a detailed account of the sabotage. There's no plaque explaining how prisoners urinated into guidance systems. There's no exhibit showing the corroded wiring or the deliberately loosened bolts. The story is mentioned briefly, almost as a footnote, but it's not given the prominence it deserves, and that's a tragedy, because the sabotage at Mittelbau-Dora represents one of the most remarkable acts of resistance in World War II, and it's been almost completely erased from popular history. We remember the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy. We remember the pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain. We remember the code breakers at Bletchley Park, but we don't remember the prisoners who weaponized their urine to save lives. Why has this story been forgotten? Part of it is discomfort. The sabotage is crude, undignified, almost absurd. It doesn't fit the heroic narratives we prefer. We want our heroes to be clean, noble, and inspiring. We want stories of bravery that we can turn into movies and monuments. But the reality of resistance is often messy, desperate, and improvised. The prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora didn't have the luxury of choosing dignified methods of resistance. They used what they had, and what they had was their bodies, their knowledge, and their willingness to die fighting. Another reason the story has been buried is that it complicates our relationship with the scientists who built the space program. Wernher von Braun and his team were celebrated as heroes of the Cold War. They put Americans on the moon. They won the space race. But they also built weapons of terror using slave labor, and the men who sabotaged those weapons were treated as anonymous victims rather than resistance fighters. Acknowledging the sabotage means acknowledging that the space program was built on a foundation of atrocity. But the story deserves to be told. It deserves to be taught in schools. It deserves to be included in documentaries and history books, because it teaches us something essential about the human spirit. It teaches us that resistance is always possible, even in the darkest circumstances. It teaches us that ordinary people, stripped of everything, can still find ways to fight for what's right. It teaches us that heroism doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes, heroism looks like a starving man urinating into a rocket guidance system because it's the only weapon he has left. And sometimes that's enough to change the course of history. The prisoners at Mittelbau-Dora didn't win the war. They didn't liberate themselves. They didn't live to see the defeat of the Third Reich. But they fought, and their fight mattered. If you ever find yourself wondering whether one person can make a difference, whether small acts of resistance matter in the face of overwhelming evil, remember this story. Remember the prisoners who sabotaged the V-2 rockets. Remember that they saved lives without ever knowing the names or faces of the people they saved. Remember that they risked everything for strangers in distant cities. And remember that their weapon of choice was so crude, so undignified, so seemingly insignificant that the Nazis never even considered it a threat. But it was. It was a threat to their war machine, to their morale, and to their belief that they could break the human spirit. The prisoners proved them wrong. They proved that no matter how much you take from a person, no matter how much you dehumanize them, you can never take away their ability to choose resistance. And that choice, repeated by hundreds of men over months and years, added up to something extraordinary. This is the story the history books don't tell you. This is the story that's been buried for decades. The story of the prisoners who fought back with the only weapons they had. The story of the men who urinated into Nazi superweapons and saved thousands of lives. The story of resistance in its most desperate, most human, and most powerful form. And now, you know it. Now you can tell it. Now you can make sure that these forgotten heroes are finally remembered. Because if we don't tell their story, if we let it fade into obscurity, then we're doing exactly what the Nazis wanted. We're erasing them. We're treating them as victims instead of fighters. And they deserve better than that. They deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, for how they fought, for how they refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. That's the legacy of Mittelbau-Dora. That's the story that needed to be told. And that's why you're here, learning about it right now.